Risk is a concept that's commonly discussed in startup vernacular. So we want to talk a little bit about risk, define that, put it into some context, and really dig in and look behind the scenes as we think about risk and the risk associated with new venturing. With that, we're going to talk about risk tolerance specifically. We're going to talk about the impact of that on the success of new ventures, and we also have a risk assessment we'll discuss as well. And this will be within our broader area of entrepreneurial behavior. So to define risk, in our context, it's the possibility of loss. It's loss of money. It's loss of time. I argue it's also loss of opportunity. And with that, there is certainly a case for understanding and being able to quantify losses of time or money, while loss of opportunity is a bit of a more esoteric or more subjective assessment. But the decision to not start a venture or not launch a product is a decision that might bear risk as well. So we're going to talk about that too. So when we look at some of the data, on the far right-hand side, there are reports that 50% of small businesses fail within the first year, and that 95% of startups fail in the first 5 years. Well, let's look at that in a little bit of a different perspective. So within our pie graph, we'll see that 30% of ventures are continually losing money. And I would say that that inevitably is going to be on a path to failure. 30% of ventures break even, so they're not growing potentially and or not generating significant funding to grow potentially, and that can be a recipe for failure. But about 40% are profitable. Now these are somewhat in contrast with the data that we see to the right, but yet they're both reported from the same source, and the measure of failure and the timeline is a bit arguable and a bit unclear. What we can take away from this is that startups that are venture funded are successful 84% of the time. Now there could be a few root causes of this. One is obviously the money. If you can get significant capital, or at least sufficient financial capital in the beginning to launch your venture and to build some momentum, you're going to have a much greater likelihood of success long term. A second one is confidence and buy-in. In order to get that funding, you've had to convince those venture investors that you have a concept that's worth funding. So you've been able to make the case and get other individuals, and in this case investors, aligned with your vision and bought in on your concept and your team to the point that they're willing to put in money. So not only is the money there, but there's also an idea of validation that's been there as well. Also, it's important to note the types of firms that venture capital invest in. They typically avoid certain industries, and we'll talk about why. They typically avoid restaurants. Restaurants are problematic for venture capitalists for a number of reasons. One is very high failure rates of up to 60%. Another is very high capital costs that are in large part unrecoverable. So by the time you pay a lease, do renovations, hire a large staff, do a reasonable amount of marketing, begin buying food, all of those are largely unrecoverable costs. And they're significant costs. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of dollars invested before you open the doors. Retail stores, commonly avoided by venture capitalists. 80% of new retail clothing and new retail stores, period, close within the first 5 years. The question of why comes to bear there as well. Fundamentally, it may be a question of uniqueness and barriers to entry. If you're selling the products of someone else and those same products are available in many other places, there's an element of uniqueness that might just be limited to your location or what other value-added services you can provide, but the product itself might be undifferentiated from other things that are out there. Now, that may not be the case with certain brands that we know. It may not be the case with some of the popular fashion apparel that we know, where the manufacturer and the retailer is one and the same. A Banana Republic, a Gap, a Brooks Brothers sell their product and only their product. And so there's some uniqueness there. The other element with retail to consider too is naturally online. And what are the competing interests there? Very difficult to successfully compete selling the products of others face-to-face if those products are also available online. A third area venture capital generally does not invest in is direct sales, where it's the individual trying to retail products of others. We find here that over 99% of people that engage in direct selling, the Pampered Chef, the Mary Kay, the Amway, lose money. And that's at the individual effort. The time and the expense they put into it, they don't recover 99% of the time. So we see here a few examples that if we were to take these out of the broader equations that look at the failure rate of startups, the climate would look much better. And so these are industries that are somewhat separated from the types of concepts that we're going to be talking about within our courses of technology-based concepts and the types of things that tend to be more aligned with what VCs do. And we focus on the things that are a bit more innovative and a bit more difficult to replicate and that are more knowledge-based than financial-based and what it takes to get them launched. So how to start a startup? Well, there are many approaches. This one I found interesting. One is that it encourages you in step one to think about the concept and to think about it in the context of the future. To go into a retailer and see what's available and think about what you may introduce that's different, it's not terribly valuable. It's going to take you 3 months or 6 months to get your product to market. And all of the products that are in that retailer are going to change over time. And there are new products that are going to come to market in 3 or 6 months. So you can't just be competitive with what's in the market now. You have to think ahead, 3 months out, 6 months out, even years out, to what's going to be competitive then. And where are new products going? And what are new patents that are being issued? And what are new products that are being demoed at trade shows? And what new research is going to inspire new products? So that's a great place to start of beginning to think about looking into the future and what products or service concepts you have may be competitive there. And what's missing in the world. And writing that down and examining it and exploring and beginning to talk to other people about it. A prototyping in a very basic sense. It might be with paper. It might be with wood. It might be simply drawing what a website or an app may look like in a Word document or in PowerPoint, a wireframing. So a very basic rendition before you've really gone down the path of building something that's sellable. And the reason you do that is you can show that to someone. You can show that to dozens or 100 prospective customers to get their feedback before you invest the time and energy in actually trying to build something. You can then iterate and use that feedback. Maybe you think you need 5 features. Maybe the customers only care about 3. Maybe they're only willing to pay for 2. Well, that lets you know not to spend the time or money to build that 5-feature product because the customers don't want it and they're not willing to pay for it. But you do know what 2 features are most important and where you can focus your energy and your money on and bring that product to market first. You can then register your form your company, find funding if needed, and then launch. And remember, you've already had a collection of customers that have had some input that might be primed to be your first paying customers. You can then follow up, you can grow, you can scale, and you can keep growing. But remember, again, some of the early elements here were not the things that many people do, like I have an idea, let me get a business card, let me think of a web domain, let me launch a website. All of those are much further things to do downstream. It starts with validating the concept, thinking about the specific feature set, and testing that with customers and getting their feedback. So the next thing I want to talk about is the propensity of risk in entrepreneurs. Do entrepreneurs, by definition, show a higher natural tendency to take risk? The short answer is no. And we found over and over with research that there's really no significant difference between the risk tolerance of entrepreneurs and non-entrepreneurs. Non-entrepreneurs being those individuals that are working within corporations or organizations that are not going down a new venture path. So why do some pursue venturing and some not, or what's different about risk? Well, one element is that we all see risk differently. Our perceptions differ, and the perceptions differ between entrepreneurs and non-entrepreneurs. So we both may have a common risk tolerance, but what we see as risky differs. It's in the eye of the beholder. And with that, it's conceptualized based on our own assessment of risk and uncertainty and our own assessment of the benefits and the cost. If you're seeking a high income, if you're seeking significant freedom over how you spend your time, if you're seeking high autonomy or control over products or services, you're probably not going to get that within an established company. And if you do, it's probably going to be years or decades away. That may be a risky proposition for some. If you're seeking a reliable income, if you're seeking a well-defined product or customer, and some sense of job security, you're probably not going to find that in high levels with startups. So a startup would be risky if those are the measures that you're guided by. However, if you want to have the opportunity for significant income, if you want to have some reasonable high measure of flexibility and autonomy and control, then a startup could be a good fit. And a startup would be a less risky proposition to pursue those elements than would a traditional employment relationship. So it all depends on your measure of risk and your assessment of benefits and costs. So we've talked a little bit about risk. We've talked about what it means, some different contexts, how it may differ from entrepreneurs and non-entrepreneurs. Now let's talk about some ways to mitigate risk. Successful tech entrepreneurs in specific find that they can manage risk and reduce risk by doing a number of things. And we'll talk about three of those. We'll talk about their search for information. We'll talk about minimizing their investment. And we'll talk about maintaining or maximizing their flexibility. So for the first element of searching for information, what we mean here is that many entrepreneurs that are unsuccessful just start doing things. It's a mantra of they fire before they aim. And we want to take heed to that, and we want to be planful. We still want to take action, but we want to think about what we're doing before that. The element of doing a business model canvas is something we'll talk about later. We'll also talk about business plan development. And while authoring a business plan doesn't guarantee your success, and while you may get many things wrong in the beginning, a key value of it is it puts your thoughts and your ideas to paper, and it forces you to connect disparate themes of thinking about the product and who's my customer and what's my market and how am I going to finance it and what level of funding do I need and what team am I going to build. And it begins to get those thoughts down, ideally on a timeline with some quantitative measures, and it puts you on path to doing some research and to begin thinking about information and trying to validate that information and analyzing markets and thinking about customers and doing it all within a cohesive document. And it's that search process and that process of thinking that I believe is more valuable than the document itself. A second element is minimizing your investment. A key piece of that is doing your customer discovery and your customer validation before you go down the path of product building and company building. So this mirrors explicitly what we were talking about with doing a simple prototype with paper, wood, or PowerPoint before you start building software or building an electronics device. See if people want it. Have a rough rendering to get their feedback. A pivot may happen in that you may not be right. The customer's needs may be different. The customer themselves may be different than who you believe you've built your product for. The Honda Pilot is a product that the intended customer isn't what the ultimate customer was. So in that way, there are a variety of elements, even that large companies gauge, that are a mismatch with what they think in the beginning, but they find a different customer in the end. Another way to minimize that investment is following this lean startup principles that we'll talk a little bit about later as well. It starts at the top, at the 12 o'clock, of having an idea and building it. And while the vernacular shown here is a little bit custom to software, the basic principles are the same for any type of venture. It's a measure of having an idea, building a prototype, deploying it, and then measuring feedback, of seeing how people respond, of capturing their likes and dislikes. What would they change? Learning from that, retuning the idea, and building it again. And you're able to move through multiple iterations from an alpha, a beta, a version 1, a version 2, a bronze, a silver, a gold, a basic, a premium. There are a variety of different things and titles you can attach to such things. But the basic premise is start with something simple, get it to market as soon as possible, get feedback, and then iterate from there. The third element of risk reduction is maintaining flexibility. A couple of key elements here is that this lets you make those pivots and make those adaptations to your product or service at a much lower cost if you're thinking about being flexible. What this does is it lets you test different market segments and find out where you fit and how people are going to respond to what you're offering, and give you the opportunity to adapt that or change that if need be. Some simple ways to do this are trying to use off-the-shelf product rather than custom products. If you have a software concept, see if there's a white label solution that's out there. See if I can use a Squarespace or a website builder to get me a version 1 of my offering. See what you can do to, again, not be fully committed as far as the product design until you really know who your customer is and that's been validated. So in summary, entrepreneurs are not inherently risk seekers. We instead see risk differently than non-entrepreneurs. And the way that we mitigate that and put that into practice, have that idea, build a version, a simple version, try it, test it, measure feedback, look at your data, learn from that, build it a second time. And you can iterate through these cycles as fast as possible to get to something that's sellable. But the orientation of it is to think about searching for information as you're doing that, of minimizing your investment, and try and maintain your flexibility along the way.